Biomes, the global mutator of DRG's missions. The regions are not to be trifled with, as they can often mold an otherwise simple objective into a challenge, densely packed with visual fluff to complement the art style. As you're about to see, Planet Hoxie's has a lot of things to check out. You could say I'm a biome connoisseur, or maybe a biome addict at this point. Am I the one who's obsessed? The best way I can think of getting rid of my obsession for biomes is by tackling literally everything that there is to them. I mean, here's what's quite possibly the first lineup of biome concepts. Reading through these is beyond intriguing. By the end of this long-ass video, I'll go through this list and see what ideas I believe to have stuck around. You can make your own guesses as you go through each chapter, if you want, I guess. Anyway, I want to address the pronunciation of this planet real quick. The thing is, there is no correct pronunciation. Hoxes is often said by dwarves.
Surfing Hoxes!
And Hoxies is often said by mission control.
Welcome to Planet Hoxie's, Miner.
But this isn't evolution of pronunciation. At least I don't think it is. Let's just get to the point. How do biomes actually work? First, you'll have to get the gist of the cave generation system, which in itself hasn't changed that much from its pre-alpha counterpart. The general idea is that it first picks some caves or some rooms from a pool compatible with the chosen mission type. These caves will contain predetermined areas where it can connect to the tunnels. In linear missions, it'll be finished off by a room with a singular connection point. Of course, tunnels are rarely that short in mining expedition, so developers do some mumbo-jumbo that forces the tunnels to generate extra long. Maybe it's that the tunnels aren't allowed to be a certain steepness, so it just ends up creating these spirals? If I'm incorrect, I got a developer to fact check me here. But afterward comes the biome manipulation, because otherwise these caves would be featureless, super smooth rooms, like eating plain spaghetti without any sauce and cheese. In the biome's early phase, their effect was a lot more minimalistic, mainly changing the cave's colors and minor details. Biome features at this time were cave features. They act about the same as the former, except they weren't tied to a biome. For example, exploding plants could appear on any region. Same for poisonous clouds, regular fog, rain, mushrooms, and even lava geysers. Biomes in their early days felt much more like backdrops rather than unique environments. A major change took place around the game's early access launch. This brand new system is what ultimately ended up defining biomes. The biome's new job is to mold the cave presets, to give them a distinctive appearance that would fit a specific theme. This can create the illusion that some cave formations are biome specific. In some sense, you'd be right. I've had the opportunity to get a developer to showcase the biome generation while I was at their offices, but the footage kinda sucks. So I got him to do it again, this time with a direct screen recording. Alright, this needs a little bit of explaining. What we are seeing here is something the developers use to create new room formations for the game. These spherical shapes represent any given chunk of the room, and this shape represents its height. The idea is that no biome should go over the yellow limit within these shapes, since the biomes themselves now mess with the shape of these chunks through something called noises. To give a quick example of noises, here's Glacial Strata with all noise values set to 0, and here it is with greatly exaggerated values. Each biome has these values for their floors and walls. In some cases, they even have separate values for ceilings. Going back to the developer's example, here's what this particular room would look like if generated in salt pits. Perfectly fits within the yellow shapes. A big chunk of the biomes end up matching the shape. But then there is Sandblasted Corridors. It's ignoring the developer built rooms entirely, giving the various rooms a very different shape. Hence why in some ways you could call this a biome-specific room. The developer, Anders, has noted that in these examples, large chunks like coral or granite don't generate until jumping into the game. Various elements like that help to further distort the original room to something distinct. To give you a rough idea of the biome's elements, but really just to mess with you, here's Glacial Strata with Salt Pit's elements. Here's Bough with Sandblasted Corridors elements. While the results are intriguing, this does give us a good example of how much the biomes rely on these elements. Have I been saying elements enough? Hopefully the next time you play DRG, the illusion will be slightly more broken. You get to carry this burden with me now. Anyway, let's get to the real deal now, the actual evolution. As always, look to the top left to see the current time period I'm covering. And keep in mind that I aim for the notable builds. I'm not about to extend this into an 8-hour video where I painstakingly mention every single hotfix for every single chapter. I like to skip over a bunch of builds to rack up changes, so when I say things like next build, I will always mean the next notable version of the game. Let's start this off with the pre-alpha. This could very well give us a peek at a nearly biomeless DRG, or even at a different planet, one that's called Djord VII. If this were the lore series, this is the part where I'd speculate that you're an early visitor of this asteroid or planet. As mentioned in Space Rig Evolution, the very early lore idea is that the dwarves are exploring a bunch of huge asteroids for minerals. To be fair, around the time of this pre-alpha build, it was pretty much settled on planet exploration. So this canonically takes place on Djord, or Djord VII, according to an unreleased trailer, which you can only find a chunk of on my hidden history video. But since there's nothing else to go off of, we could unofficially label this pre-alpha biome as Djord VII, going with George because it sounds cooler. First of all, the most apparent thing about these caves are just how dark they are. Everything that isn't lit up by flares is entirely pitch black. The flares themselves have incredibly rich shadows and lighting, which contributes to the pre-alpha's poor performance but undeniably results in some great visuals. The caves purely consist of brown-colored floors, sand-colored walls, and gray-colored dirt, which might have been clay or maybe gravel at the time, who knows. Common cave details include random patches of brown grass, green crystal pebbles, harmless spiderwebs, tons of stalactites and stalagmites which are not real because you can walk through them. There are also lots of green crystal formations. Depending on the mission, blue crystals may also appear alongside them. The only real difference between them is that the blue one is indestructible. Some rarer features are the purple mushrooms, which are sometimes responsible for the poisonous spore, and it sometimes isn't. Lastly, fire or lava geysers can be found on the Bough mission. They deal a ton of damage and are seemingly entirely exclusive to this one room formation, which is still used to this very day. I only had a screenshot. Moving along to the next pre-alpha build, Djord VII has noticeably become overall brighter. Seems that all of the cave's colors were turned up a notch. This clay gravel thing now spreads its pebbles around itself rather than acting as protrusions. Tons of details from the previous build have inexplicably disappeared. Stalactites and stalagmites are still present, albeit less common. There's not much else aside from the obvious lack of detail. So let's move on to the next pre-alpha build. Right away, it's apparent that the cave color scheme has changed, and the previously missing details are back. The ground is now a different shade of dark brown, plus it got a texture change. The walls were made just barely brown, and the clay gravel thing was changed into something I'd call dirt, featuring a very familiar texture. Sadly, this janky method was the best way to showcase the color changes, since flares at this time had their own distinct colors, which would cause color pollution to the walls. There are no other differences that I can find, but one of the new missions in this build features glowing crystals for the first time. Most of them are plastered on the ceiling, creating this neat glow. That mostly wraps up the pre-alpha, but this cave will live on for a bit longer as the art director kinda wanted to turn this into a biome of its own. So perhaps we should jump to the closed alpha, which for the first time introduces biomes to the game. A reminder that this era used the old system, so cave features will be covered separately from the biomes exclusively for this chapter. The closed alpha mainly featured 4 biomes: rock caves, lava caves, ice caves rule, and a bit later radioactive. Yeah, just radioactive. Obviously, these acted as placeholder names which in time were swapped out for Site 11 Deep Shell, Magma Core, Upper Arctic Mantle, and radioactive wastes. Since these biomes barely changed throughout the closed alpha, I thought that Update 5 is the best build to explore them in. Site 11 Deep Shell is what became of the pre-alpha biome. The color scheme was basically made brighter with the biome's crystals made purely purple. Instead of clusters of grass, now there are small patches of grass. There are also seemingly a lot less stalagmites. I believe that some parts of this biome live on in Crystalline Caverns. Magma Core is indeed the longest surviving biome. I felt the need to separate this from the Magma Core chapter because the biome served a different role at this time. The color scheme consists of a green ground, pink walls, and a light brown ceiling. The biome's crystals are dark gray. Although it's quite barren, some alien plants can be found throughout the biome, and floating dust or spore particles are also present. Strangely, in a slightly earlier build, Magma Core was full of blue grass and green things. I've come to the conclusion that it was either put into the biome as an experiment or by accident. Obviously, this biome continued on as Magma Core, but I'm willing to bet some of its early ideas were reused for dense Biozone. Upper Arctic Mantle. The color scheme consists of light brown ground and light gray walls. The biome's crystals are green. The only notable feature is how empty the biome is. It was mostly reserved for the easier missions. I believe that some parts were reused for Radioactive Exclusion Zone. Despite its name, I don't think it had much to do with Glacial Strata. And the fourth biome, Radioactive Wastes. The color scheme is really just some shades of green. Crystals cannot be found on this biome. Patches of green grass cover some of the terrain. Stalactites and stalagmites are long and pointy. Yeah. For the first time, biome-specific features can be found on radioactive wastes. Air geysers, which propel dwarves upward. Deep Tora honeycomb. It indeed contains swarms of insects. Cave urchins, which honestly stand out like a sore thumb in this biome. And lastly, cave vines, which can spawn in these large clusters in this build. They've been harmless from the very beginning, even when reaching for the dwarves. Despite the biome's name, I believe this was a precursor to Fungus Bogs, with some ideas indeed ending up in Radioactive Exclusion Zone. Now it's time to explore the cave features, as these eventually make it into the biomes we all know and love. Update 2 features lava geysers, which are pretty much unchanged from the pre-alpha. Poisonous fog now dons a green color, assumedly to make its danger much clearer. Explosive plants were first introduced in this update. They behave about as expected. When damaged, they expand and explode, which can result in a chain reaction of explosions. Mushrooms, while they provide no gameplay changes, they do indeed count as a cave feature. Their appearance is very similar to the pre-alpha, with the added large mushrooms and particle effects. Rain also counts as a cave feature. Not entirely sure if it overrides any other feature. Xenofossils, which appear to be a fossilized creature of varying sizes. The largest variant can take up a huge portion of a room, potentially the predecessor of the glyphids. Alien flora, or as they're internally called, alien nest. I believe these could have been the original nests for glyphids. They serve no purpose outside of decoration. And lastly, glowing blue crystals, which have changed from their pre-alpha counterpart, now mostly emerging from the ground and emitting a gentle blue light source. Said light can be extinguished with a pickaxe. Hopping over to an early Update 4 build, glowing blue crystals were made significantly smaller. Explosive plants had their appearance slightly adjusted, now sporting dark purple for its base and red for its bubbles, as opposed to its brown and orange appearance. The passive pulsating animation is also much more lively. When exploding, it releases a bunch of burning hot droplets. No, I don't think that those are sparks, judging from their trajectory. Next up is Update 5. Lava Geyser received some visual adjustments. The erupting geyser effect was updated, along with the geyser model itself, which was repainted to green and reshaped. Explosive plants now feature an animated texture for the glowing effect, and the xenofossil was given a unique rock texture. Now coming to Update 6, the final closed alpha update. Again, this is around the time that cave features were transitioning into biome features. Explosive plants now emit stronger glows. Their glow animation is much more apparent where the entire plant periodically becomes dim. The explosion effects were greatly toned down, so they aren't as blinding anymore, and the plant now explodes into small chunks of itself. The xenofossil had its model changed to various bone formations, most notably this giant ribcage. Glowing crystals have had their large formations restored. And that about wraps up the closed alpha stuff. From here on out, biomes work pretty much identical to the way they do in modern DRG. Though there is one loose end we have to take care of from the closed alpha mess, that being Magma Core. While we can speculate all day which alpha biomes became which, this is without a doubt the longest surviving biome of the game. For its redesign process, the artists gathered a bunch of references to pin down on its brand new appearance. Even ended up drawing some rough concepts like these. And thus, Magma Core's journey continues into the extremely early Update 7 builds, having undergone some drastic changes. The color scheme and room characteristics are nothing like its predecessor. The caves are now very barren. The ground was turned into a light shade of brown, and the walls were made gray. Rooms have a distinctive ring characteristic, which can often mold neat arches into rooms. Lava Geyser is now exclusive to this biome. The geyser's shape has changed and was made to actually be part of the terrain. Steam Geyser can also appear in this biome, which was also embedded into the terrain. Both the lava and steam geysers can now be destroyed, creating a powerful explosion. A thick fog can appear on select surfaces, as well as a large untextured rectangle called Big Earthquake. Initially, I thought it wasn't functional, but in this Steam Geyser clip, we can see a random earthquake occurring. In the next build, Magma Core undergoes yet another drastic shift in its appearance, although now it looks a lot more familiar. The color scheme was made entirely dark gray. The biome's characteristics were amplified, and loose cinders now float in the air. The magma's caves are once again filled with various features such as tons of stalactites, yellow things, Shrek ears, and chrome puff. Mineral chimneys were added, as well as explosive plants. The explosive plants themselves emit a weaker glow once again, although their explosive effects were polished up. The earthquake is much more intense, featuring more than just a screen shake, complemented by various effects in the surrounding caves. And lastly, the steam geysers were removed from the biome. Skipping over to the early access launch of Update 7's release, yellow tubule was added. The texture for explosive plants glowing was adjusted to not go completely dim anymore. Upon detonation, the plant now leaves a large puff of smoke. An orange glowing maggot variation was added, which creates an explosion upon death. The lava geyser's fire effect was revamped. And lastly, ash can be found floating in the air alongside cinders. On Update 9, the explosive plant's smoke effect was greatly toned down. And that's it. Hopping over to an early Update 14 build, an early iteration of Hot Rock can be found. Despite its early appearance, it behaves pretty much as expected, embedding itself into the ground and damaging dwarves that step on it. As for the lava geyser, it now constantly emits glowing and had some extra touch-ups done to its eruption effects. On Update 14's release, the Hot Rock's appearance was finalized, looking a lot more like, well, like magma. It was also made that blowing up any surface of the biome would create hot rock around the affected area. The lava geyser's eruption was toned down. Much fewer splashes of lava emerged from it. Moving on to Update 17's development, which features early small lava geysers. They activate periodically with a flamethrower-like effect and were really fucking loud. It could also set dwarves on fire for an extended period. And now for Update 17's release. The small lava geysers were given a cinder effect which acts as a warning for its eruption. And the eruption effect itself was made much smaller. In turn, it also instantly sets the dwarves on fire but doesn't last very long. There were also some live cinders placed around the lava geysers. And the earthquakes can now randomly make magma crevices that sometimes completely change the environment. From there on out, Magma Core pretty much remained unchanged. While there was that one time when they accidentally removed the small lava geysers, or how they misaligned the explosive plant's pulsating effect, hopefully it's fixed by now. Hopefully. Next up is the mushroom-infested region Fungus Bogs. The idea for this biome has mostly remained the same throughout development. The artists really tried to gather some crazy-looking mushrooms when figuring out this biome's look. In this artwork, we can even spot something that looks a lot like an apoca bloom. Not entirely sure when exactly this biome's lifeline begins, but I'm certain it's slightly before Update 7 early development build. This is as early as I'll be able to get for most of the original biomes. Aside from how barren it is, the resemblance to its release counterpart is very strong from the get-go, maintaining this exact color scheme from very early on. Even the room noise is relatively similar. There are also clusters of two different types of mushrooms throughout the caves. From the looks of things, this seems to be a very primitive implementation of a system that's meant to spread the mushrooms around in an area. Alongside them, very early goo puddles can be found, which pretty much behave as expected, except they can be easily removed with a pickaxe. In the next build, the biome already gets fleshed out with detail. Large patches of animated grass and various rocky details now cover a large portion of the surfaces, including walls and ceilings. The aforementioned mushrooms now come in various sizes and properly spread around the area. Hollow red mushrooms were added to this pool. Their designs were based off this real fungus thing. Brown mushrooms make a comeback from the pre-alpha with its own fumes and everything. Fun fact, the mushroom voice line is already in place.
Mushroom.
Alongside them, the rare xenofungus variation was added, emitting a blue glow in the darkness, and in some cases it's just stretched out for some reason. An early iteration of wall-mounted xenofungi were added to the biome. Hitting it makes a bunch of missing particles show up, followed by a violent purple splatter. The air geyser makes a return with a different rocky appearance. Gameplay-wise, it behaves pretty much as expected, propelling the dwarves upward. Glyphid eggs were added, seemingly using the same cocoon model as the dreadnoughts, just with a different color. Popping an egg will spawn a swarmer and won't cause any chain reactions at this time. Lastly, poison spores were also added. They release poisonous fumes when approached or damaged, behaving as expected. Also, the goo puddles are absent from this build. In the next development build, vines were added, although very poorly as they clip through the ceiling a lot. The appearance of the wall xenofungus was slightly adjusted, and I spotted the return of a xenofossil. In the next build, vines clipping through non-endless ceilings was fixed, and the wall xenofungus once more received adjustments. When it comes to the brown mushrooms, the slightly bigger brown mushroom was made significantly larger. Meanwhile, the blue mushroom has seemingly become rarer around this time. I've also come across the cave vine. I believe it was also a rare biome feature for Fungus Bogs at this time, which was later removed entirely. In this build, only the glyphid eggs received an appearance change, having its details colored purple and coming in 3 different shapes. Hopping over to the early access launch, the wall xenofungi were redesigned into a large platform with striking white and blue colors. When it comes to the other mushrooms, the larger outlier mushrooms found in mushroom clusters have bigger size variations. Green poisonous maggots were also added to the bogs, and the glyphid eggs received the final visual adjustments. This is also when shooting one egg has a chance to pop multiple of them. In Update 10, they officially introduced the goo puddles. They slow down dwarves like their early counterpart, but are embedded deeper into the surfaces it covers, making it harder to remove. Although unmentioned, the glow tree was added to the biome, where shooting any of its bulbs will make it emit a strong light source. Shooting all of its bulbs will make it light up in a large area for a long time. For this one build, they experimented with different shades of color and textures for the biome. Seems as though the walls use the same dirt texture as the ones blocking tunnel entrances. In Update 14, the red explosive plant can now spawn in the biome. Around this time, the patches of grass were made to spread around a much larger area instead of being clustered up into bushes. Also, the color of vines was changed to fit the Fungus Bogs color scheme much better. On Update 27, they added giant tree roots sprawling throughout the biome. It comes with its own unique destruction effects. Also around this time, the glow tree had become a permanent light source when fully lit. In Update 31, these huge mushrooms with purple spots on their cap were added. And on Update 33, the giant roots got a different destruction effect. And that's it. Since then, Fungus Bogs hasn't received any significant changes. A few loose ones fixing up bugs and whatever else. Yeah, I saw the goop animation bug out there. Don't worry. But now's time to tackle an entirely alien-looking jungle. That being dense Biozone, known for its alien-like vegetation scattered throughout the entire region. Some would argue that it carries an aquatic feeling. There's no shortages of concepts for this. Here's the earliest concept for the biome. Internally it was known as just lush. Here are some ideas for biome features that they drew up. Yeah, Lush Downpour was another early name for this region. This biome most notably went through the most name changes. It even had something that looks almost like key art made of this region. Oh, the head crab looking things? Those are just early glyphid designs, don't mind them. On March of 2017, the developers uploaded an early biome testing video. From the update and build numbers, we can tell that it takes place sometime during Update 2's development. This is where we can spot what seems to be the earliest state of dense Biozone, when it was still called just Lush. The color scheme is seemingly already established from such an early state. Has a large amount of vegetation. It even has the iconic vertical layers of edges. Furthermore, in another devlog, we can spot what is one of the earliest iterations of the glowlit plant. During Update 7's early development, the biome's name was straight up Equatorial Biozone. Barely any changes were made to it from the lush counterpart. There's overall less grass, the vertical layers are less exaggerated, and the dirt walls have green sludge-like markings on top of the regular ones. In the next build, extra details were added to the biome's vegetation. Mainly these strange alien plants. Glowing flora can be seen in the darkness emitting a cyan glow, but the flower itself is in fact green. These jutting out plateau rocks were added to the cave walls. Wall eyes were added which passively look around and perform cool eye tricks. They also stare at dwarves as they're approached and temporarily close their eye when poked. In the next development build, even more details were added to the vegetation. Mainly these red bulb plants. These spiky plants were added, which kinda resemble a glyphid's leg when you think about it. Clusters of these cup-shaped plants and clusters of these orange coral-like flora were added. And that's a tongue twister. Coral tongues were added to the cave walls, and poodle shells were also added to the ceiling. These periodically leak out a liquid that's currently harmless. In the next build, the biome's name changes to Dense Biozone. The plateau rocks completely changed shape into these jagged balls. Early appearance of the elevator plant was added. By stepping on or hitting the plant, it'll shift its position between 2 points. These mechanics work identically to its final version, but it does emit a different scream upon death. Ejector cacti were added to this biome, which periodically launch a bunch of spikes. Again, behaving as expected. Aside from that disgusting sound. Cave urchins were also added, which play a short animation of them expanding when either touched or damaged. And glyphid eggs can appear in the region now. There was this strange development build I found. For this build, only Dense Biozone is inexplicably full of glyphid eggs pretty much every time I generate it. They would even spawn on ceilings, which normally never happens. Also, the glowing flora was given a semi-broken pulsating animation here. Skipping over to Update 7's release, the biome's colors overall became more saturated. Xenofossils were added. Ejector cacti's sound was changed. The glowlit plant was added, which emits a light source when approached and hides the light if pickaxed. The glowing color of these green flowers was changed to green, and its pulsating animation was fixed. Lastly, gigantic cave corals were added to the region, which surprisingly add a lot to the biome. For Update 11, similar build used for DRG Legacy, the elevator plant's appearance was finally updated with a fitting look, meaning that this early counterpart survived for quite some time. On Update 12, the cave jelly was added, and the elevator plant's model was finalized, with a lot more flair added to its sleeve. On Update 14, the Pudo shell was removed. The biome's textures were adjusted and most notably aren't as saturated anymore. The small rock details are noticeably much shinier. Silicate Harvester is now shuffling through the Biozone. The cyan-colored explosive plant was also added. I should note that it was initially colored green, going all the way to Update 21 where an early iteration of the Netosite Shocker was added to the biome, which uses a recolored model of the Cave Cruiser. The Trapacactus was also added during this update. It stabs dwarves that get close to it and emits a yellow puff when hit. They also reverted those extra shiny rocks. Let's skip over to Update 25. The devs added the occasional heavy rain that occurs in the biome, and by this time the Netosite Shocker received a unique model of its own. But we aren't exactly focusing on creatures right now. During Update 31's development, they added 4 coral variations. This purple coral, which resembles chanterelle mushrooms growing on top of each other. This orange one with tubes, which resembles Earth's sea coral. This pink one that kinda looks like a robot arm. And finally this spherical coral, mostly yellow with dark brown spots throughout its surface. For Update 31's release, they changed the spherical coral's color to orange, which greatly resembles the fruit of the same name. And of course, the screams have changed. That wraps up Dense Biozone. Whether it's surprising or not, the biome style has remained extremely consistent throughout its evolution. Now it's time for something much more barren, Radioactive Exclusion Zone. This one also features some neat concepts. Here we can see some extremely early concepts of an idea very similar to what we ended up getting, at this time simply called Arid. Here we see the artists getting a more concrete idea of what they want to go for. Yeah, that mouth plant is apparently a real planet Earth formation. While this is unmarked, it undoubtedly has a bunch of similarities to... Yeah, I saw the mouths and I knew this was for Radioactive Zone. Let's actually bring up that video of those super early biomes again, because we get to see the arid region as well. This could very well be the earliest iteration of this biome. It looked a lot like a moon cave here. Now let's start with Update 7's development build. A common theme in these early iterations is how barren the biomes start off. Like this is more barren than arid. Harmless lime-colored crystals can form, and they also come in minuscule stud sizes, which serve as a nice guide. These various spike-like formations found on the cave grounds might be a remnant from arid. Walking through them shatters these small stalagmites. Wall eyes are already fully functional in this build. They can track dwarves and close when hit with a pickaxe. Oh, deja vu. With one noticeable difference to the model itself, giving it a kind of starfish look. That's the best way I could describe it. I don't know. In the next build, the biome gets a bit more populated with various oddities. A blue-colored Radipuff is added, appearing livelier than ever. Green-colored Tubal was added to the wrong biome, but it was removed shortly after. Tumorous growths have started forming, and the community-adored character, the Breather, was added with a white body and cyan-colored lips. It emits a green glow when not around light sources, and comes in more sizes than one. On to the next build. Here the biome is further populated, mostly with temporary features. Dust particles were added. Tumorous growth are more numerous. Something happened to the glowing crystals. For some reason they turned into a shiny brown color. When pinged, it lists them as white crystals. Toxic clouds were temporarily brought back with improved visuals and more effects. Wall eyes lost its starfish-like appearance. Glow tree was also added to the wrong biome. Shooting its bulbs makes said bulb jiggle with a janky animation. It also lights up for a much shorter time. And cave vines were brought back. It can sometimes spawn in huge rooms, resulting in extremely long vines. Pretty sure this can still happen actually. In the next build, Radioactive Zone gets some familiar features. This is where the glow tree got removed. An early iteration of irradiated crystals was added, which lights up and damages any approaching dwarves. It can also be destroyed, making it feature complete. A bunch of harmless spiderwebs were added to the ceilings, and Toxic Cloud had its particles changed to much smaller ones. Here's an odd build. The biome's color scheme inexplicably turns monochrome, and the Tubal got removed. I am unsure if this was an experiment or done by complete accident since it nicely contrasts with the biome's colorful features. Leaning towards a cool glitch with this one. In the next build, the biome further progresses to its first debut. Firstly, the toxic cloud was removed, but poisonous maggots were added to the biome. Many of the plants were made pingable and destroyable. Atmospheric effects were changed to small chunks instead of dust. The floor has a different, more detailed texture. The walls were made green. Irradiated crystals now feature glowy bits around them. Rock trees or dead trees were added, and Radioactive had its appearance changed. Had its animation slowed down a bit. It became larger and is now colored after the biome, green and white. Now's the time for Update 7's release. The biome mainly received general adjustments. For example, its color palette was tweaked, as well as a different ground texture was incorporated, and a chromatic abbreviation effect was added to complement the radioactive theme. They are most noticeable at the edges of the screen. By Update 14's release, the biome has received quite a few adjustments. Biome's color scheme has changed, getting rid of the green walls and replacing them with gray ones, as well as the ground having its texture swapped. The irradiated crystals were made a stronger green. Its particles seemingly are coming from the crystal instead of passively floating, and it also emits this fancy reflection onto the biome surfaces. Almost like you don't need resource-draining overrated graphic settings. Regular crystal has changed to a black crystal with very intense reflections. The particle bits floating in the air were made a lot more abundant, and the rock tree isn't completely obsidian black anymore. For Update 16, they adjusted the coloring of the region's crystals. The regular crystal, despite still being called a white crystal, was colored green, and irradiated crystals were changed to a lime color again. They also feature a more distinct texture. Skipping over to Update 23's development, known for its additions of many common creatures. Alongside them came the Radioactive Zone's exclusive enemy types. Each of the irradiated types had a green body and a brown shell, with the swarmers being pure green and emitting a green glow. Functionally, they behave similarly. Exploding Glyphid will leave behind a temporary irradiated zone. The Praetorian emits a ring of radiation when roaring, and leaves strong radiation upon death. Most unusually, the Swarmer's glow will actually cause a radiation effect when approaching dwarves. Also, the regular crystals received a different shade of green. The crystal's radiation source was made more visible, so disabling them would be easier, and their surface reflections were toned down. For Update 23's release, the radiation Glyphid variants have a more streamlined appearance, shedding those brown-colored shells. And the swarmers no longer constantly irradiate dwarves when getting near them. For Update 31, they added giant error helixes. They feature strangely colored pebbles from where they emerge. Their coloring reminds me of those early crystals from many builds ago. Lastly, for Season 2, they added the ability to pet breathers and cave vines. And since then, the biome hasn't gotten anything notable. This could be the only biome to have been updated during the game season era. Well, so far anyway. Going from something barren to something equally as barren, but a lot more open. Sandblasted Corridors. This one features just drawings of various ideas for the biome's plants and structures. I think this is one instance where none of these actually survived. Aside from the pebbles, of course. Starting with my earliest Update 7 development build. It is indeed extremely barren. The texture of walls is much more pronounced, complemented by a dirtier ground texture and light green fog. Dust particles are floating through the caves and unique glowing crystals can be found. It looks as though the core of the crystal is black but features a light blue sheen. In the next build, the biome has received a significant touch-up. Tons of grass patches and other shrubbery were added. Wall textures were adjusted to complement the art style better. An early iteration of the explosive spore was added. Shooting it will cause it to release the projectile at an arc, which can be used as a very crude form of transportation. The spore regrows over time, allowing for further launches. The ejector cacti was initially intended for this biome. It behaves pretty much as expected, shooting out a bunch of spikes in many directions periodically. I personally really enjoyed the atmosphere of this particular version of Sandblasted Corridors, but this doesn't survive for long. In the next build, the biome gets some large adjustments, already making it hard to differentiate from the release version. Biome's fog color was changed to a blue tint. Most patches of grass were removed. Various rock formations and xenofossils were added. Explosive spore was recolored to purple. but can still spawn in huge numbers at times. In the next notable build, holy moly, look at that giant rock! You don't get stuff like that anymore. Glow Tree was added to this biome, and Deep Tora Honeycomb was brought back with a new insect swarm. But the insect themselves are just oversized dust particles at the moment. Skipping over to Update 7's release where players experienced the biome for the first time, but it hasn't changed that much. Deep Tora Honeycomb now has actual insects in its swarm. Explosive Spore got a new animation for regenerating the giant spore. I also got this sick shot. Various rock tree formations were added. Dust clouds were added to complement the atmosphere. And various small rocks were spread around the large rock formations. Jumping to Update 14's release, one of the few post-early access updates done to the biome. The color scheme was adjusted. Ground color is now a lot lighter and walls were made a stronger orange. Sandstorms were added to the biome, as well as wind tunnels which appear to come in much larger numbers. They of course push dwarves around. Let me tell you, those sandstorms had an awful noise in its development build. In Update 20, actually the biome didn't get any notable changes since Update 14. Instead, we'll be focusing on the Nayaka Trawler for a bit since it's exclusive to this biome. Around this time, a prototype version of the trawler, or of the shark, was put in the game files. It had very rough behavior. It burrows through the sand aimlessly. If it happens to hit a dwarf, it's by pure chance. It'll make some of its infamous mid-air leaps. Yeah, like that one. Well, sometimes it will just kinda slowly fly off. After a while, it'll unburrow and chase after the player, but won't really do anything when it catches up. In Update 21, they made some progress on the shark. None to its appearance, but it's become more aggressive. It'll swift through the sand faster with some new effects to better show its position. Also performs more of those fancy jumps. It has a new charge attack indicated by that glowing rectangle. By the way, it'll never give up on its chase. Like really, it won't give up until it hits you. Oh yeah, it doesn't unburrow and slowly chase after dwarves anymore also. For Update 22, the shark got a makeover into this slimy flesh thing. Now that I look at it again, it kinda looks like an inside-out shark. Its behavior is kinda similar. Its burying effect is now mostly particles with a few rocks thrown to the sides. It'll charge at dwarves periodically still, but now it'll actually grab onto them for a little bit. After killing it, its ragdoll just won't stop moving. Skipping to Update 23, this is where they released a biome-exclusive creature. Oh, they made the Deep Tora Honeycomb emit a red glow at some point. The Nayaka Trawler is now feature complete, containing all sorts of unique sounds, and its behavior ironed out, with the additional attack of just charging through dwarves to knock them around, and properly perish instead of doing the freaky shit from earlier. And there you go. Ever since then, there were no significant changes or additions made to the biome. The most that happened over the years are silent adjustments to wind tunnels and sandstorms. Air vents don't spawn in huge groups anymore, and sandstorms overall feel less common. From one barren biome to another, time to check out Crystalline Caverns. This had some concepts made of it. The artist gathered some really neat crystal formations for its references, and some of those rough drawings were made for its features. Now, let's see how empty this biome was in that early development build. It's pretty much finished? By Update 7 standards anyway. The giant purple crystals and stalactites are already here. About the only unusual thing are the cinders floating through the air. In the development build, there were some additions made. Glowing blue crystals were added. Mineral chimneys were also added, as well as wall eyes, which are fully interactable. Skipping to the early access launch, the biome had its color scheme adjusted. Specifically, I'd say it had a boost to its color saturation. Meanwhile, the crystal formations were seemingly made pink. Look away if you're sensitive to flashing stuff, but it doesn't appear to be intentional as evidenced by this flickering. In Update 11, the caverns got one new addition, aside from the spiderwebs. Electric crystals, which arc between other crystals of the same type. They have full functionality and seem to deal a lot more damage to anyone who comes into contact. In Update 14, there were some general adjustments made. The biome's color scheme was adjusted. It's now more akin to the earlier appearance. Due to the experimentation the developers were doing at the time, all of the biome's crystals are insanely reflective to the point where they lose their own color half the time. Unlike the blue glowing crystal, which is a lot less reflective and was repainted with a light blue color, making the animated texture easier to notice. Alongside it, the electrical crystals also had changes done to their texture. It was there before, it was just difficult to see. Skipping over to Update 25's development build, this is where it mainly got a bunch of small tweaks, like those tunnels that did a driller check on the team not generating anymore. The crystals definitely received the biggest tweaks as they aren't hyper-reflective anymore, and this is where the heavy rain weather effect was added to this biome. Jumping over to Update 29's Hotfix 8 specifically, because this random hotfix added new crystals to the biome. Well, more like one crystal. This large spiky pink crystal was added with a few variations. Going to the next build, a few patches after Update 30's release, they added a lot more new crystal types. Something I dubbed as a quartz star was added, which can often take up an entire room. In some cases, this same crystal was colored purple, which I'm not entirely sure can happen anymore. A circular formation of crystals was added, and these tilted white quartz crystals were also added. From here on out, Crystalline Caverns remained pretty much the same. Now let's take a quick look at Shallow Grotto, the tutorial exclusive biome. I've already covered the mission itself in an earlier episode, so now's the time to check up on the biome. This biome was born in an early build of Update 7's development. At this time, it featured a very similar color scheme to that of Dense Biozone, just with inverted colors and less saturation. It mainly borrows features from other biomes, such as the patches of red grass, the small tube clusters, these violet stems with red glowing tops, glowing blue crystals, and even walleyes were spawning at this time. In the next development build, they changed the color scheme entirely to lime green and pine green. It's astonishing how such a simple color adjustment can really change a biome's character. Oh, and mineral chimneys were added. For Update 7's release, the biome barely gets any changes as it's already finalized. Most notably, stalactites were added, along with harmless spiderwebs, and walleyes were removed. That's it. So here's a weird build I got for you. In Update 13's development build, the biome turns gray. This is clearly unintentional, likely a misplaced texture, but it doesn't stop it from being intriguing to explore. When opening up the terrain scanner, there are these two stripes across the entire cave. Plus, the dirt texture is entirely different from anything we've seen. Oh, and look at that! Those small tube clusters changed color. Cool. Moving on to the next strange build. For this one instance, the tunnels the tutorial mission generates were made significantly longer. I believe what caused this is that the room's tunnel entrances and exits were accidentally swapped, causing the wrong tunnels to get attached to the opposite ends of the room. Here's an example of what this area is expected to look like versus what it looks like in this build. I'll also do my best to highlight where the rooms in question are, and its tunnel connection points. Hopefully this will make it easier to understand what's happening here. Aside from those two anomalies, the biome has remained identical since early access launch. Just didn't mention that the walls started reflecting light, but that's about it. Next up is a personal favorite biome, salt pits, and I have a short backstory to share with this one. Mikkel felt that Update 7 was lacking something a little extra, so the developers considered adding a brand new biome. As Mikkel was watching Star Wars The Last Jedi, he saw this cavern full of ruby-colored crystals and got inspired. Soon after, he got to work on a brand new biome. It initially really was just Crystalline Caverns but colored red and white. Of course, they made the biome stand out more with various changes to its aesthetics. And here's some concept art of stuff they've later added to the biome, plus some of the unfinished models themselves. This is the earliest I managed to find of salt pits, already in a fairly familiar state. It features reflective ruby red crystals, white salt crystals, as well as glowing crystals that are barely colored red. Smaller details like stalactites and salt clouds are here. Even small crystals that break when walked over were present. They seem to be exclusively spawning around the large red crystals at this time. For the early access launch, about the only noticeable changes I found were the small crystals emitting a little effect when broken, and these crystals getting a color adjustment. rocking a different shade of red. Only on update 10 did the biome finally get those ceiling crystals, which when shot they... Well, obviously that noise was fixed in a later patch. Other than that, there's a weird bug with the small crystals. Those that generate in or near a tunnel emit a breaking effect of a purple crystal, but those generated in a room contain the intended colors. Next up, for update 14, as has been prevalent for most biomes, the color palette got some small adjustments, where the white floors are now slightly tinted with red. The white glowing salt crystal now has a more distinctive texture on it. The red salt crystals were also affected by the crystal reflection experimentation. Large clusters of small crystals can now spawn at random parts of a given tunnel. Walking over the ones found near tunnels still does not... they are still bugged. Skipping over to update 21 to rack up some of those changes. Most notably for this update, unstable crystal platforms are added. Standing on these crystals will make them crack multiple times before shattering. These platforms also feature small crystals scattered around them. The various crystals had their reflections extremely toned down along the way, and the effects for breaking those tiny tunnel crystals were... it's still not fixed. For update 24, the Coroner Youngling was introduced. Since this creature is exclusive to salt pits, it deserves a quick mention. When compared to the regular shellback, its armor is a lot weaker. It has much less health, making it easy to kill with a single power attack, and does not feature a ranged attack. To make up for their weak nature, they often spawn in large groups. Also, breaking the small crystals near tunnels finally yields the correct effect. And by the time update 27 rolls by, they added 2 new crystal formations. Those hollow pyramid shapes that come in various sizes, as well as extra small ones that can be stepped on. And large salt cubes that also feature smaller cubes around them, although they appeared to be bigger in the previous build. And since then, the biome has been untouched. Hold up, I just spotted something. There's something off about those salt clouds. This is one continuous clip you're seeing. It just kinda snaps around and the effect seems misaligned or something. Especially when compared to its appearance in Season 1. Now we've gotten all the early access launch biomes out of the way. It's time to tackle the first biome introduced through an update. Glacial Strata. It's not too far-fetched to assume that an ice biome was in the plans for a while. Update 16 is when development started for Glacial Strata, and this here is the earliest development build I managed to get. Actually, it's not called Glacial Strata here. It has the placeholder name of Arctic region, and features this as its description. Onto the evolution. Here's what could be the earliest version of unstable ice hanging from the ceiling. When shot, it'll drop to the ground and cause a blue explosion, which can then trigger a domino effect of more of these dropping down. Here's the early oasis. Since the temperature system wasn't functional at this time, it doesn't serve a real purpose. There are also air vents, which slow down dwarves when active. Special terrain such as smooth ice is already present, which causes the movement to be faster but much more slippery when walked on. Crevice cracks in their early state emit a loud, annoying sound every time anything steps over it, sometimes for no reason whatsoever. Snow piles seem to exclusively spawn in these strange giant globs. They do slow down movement and feature an extremely rudimentary snow effect when landed on. An ice variant of the Praetorian is here, whom already has the frost spray attack, but lacks the frost cloud. And lastly, I discovered these strange ice poles of sorts. No idea what that's about. In the next build, they've brushed up on some features and added a couple new ones. Also, the cave surfaces had a color adjustment and give off the illusion of transparency. Spiky ice stalactites. In other words, icicles were added to the ceiling. Snow piles now spawn in actual piles and had their texture changed to something more appropriate. The particle effect for when jumping on it was also changed to a splash of snow, all hurtling towards one direction. I should mention that snow didn't break your fall at this time. The ability to melt ice with the flamethrower was added, as well as the breath effects. Unstable ice has received an art pass. It became green and comes in various sizes. When it drops, it now shatters. although it seemingly disappears much too early before actually shattering. Air vents have received some adjustments, and since a functional temperature system was put in, it can now freeze dwarves and creatures, eventually turning them into ice, which dwarves can break out of by repeatedly tapping V, but they may be too busy admiring their enormous beard to do so. The Oasis got a visual upgrade, but it continues to lack any functionality. Strangely, while the blizzard weather effect was added, it actually increases the dwarf's temperature, most likely a simple oversight. The platform plant was added. It features a vastly different appearance which looks like a modified explosive plant. When shot, it quickly turns into an ice platform. Ice variant of the Goo Bomber was added. It shoots an ice blob at dwarves which produces extra large spikes when landing. Leaks a slushy of freezing liquid across the terrain. It'll also leak the slushy when killed with its sack still intact. Whoa. As for the Ice Praetorian, its frost spray now freezes anything it touches. Plus it emits a barely visible and extremely volatile frost cloud upon death. Lastly, smooth ice had its texture changed, and these random light sources were littered throughout the caves. Next up is the first public experimental build of Update 16. First off, the platform plants were redesigned and given a green glow. When shot, they'll now play a new animation, and in turn, it'll form a green platform, which has some animated elements to it. The unstable ice spikes were made much larger, the tiny variants being completely removed, and they'll now properly shatter when impacting with the floor. Crevices were finally given a proper sound when opening up, plus getting out of a crevice was made faster, whereas before it was much too smooth and required some digging. Air vent appearance and effects got an art pass, as well as the temperature UI was given a new look. When frozen, you're now required to tap A and D to break out of it. The crazy stretched out beards are still here though, and yeah, the freezing overlay was changed. You're now finally able to use the Oasis to quickly warm up, but you were also able to slowly warm up through movement. The Cryo Bulb was added, reusing some parts from the old platform plant's model, and was molded into this spiky thing. When shot, it explodes into a freezing mist, freezing anything near it, including dwarves. The Ice Praetorian's ice cloud doesn't cause crazy damage anymore, just drops the dwarf's temperature quickly. And finally, the flamethrower is better at melting ice now. Now we arrive to the release of Update 16. Not too much has changed from the experimental version. There are less snowflakes in the air for one. The biome's dirt was glazed over with ice due to the extreme temperature. The platform plants no longer glow, and neither does their solidified counterpart. Falling onto snow piles now breaks your fall, making dwarves take less fall damage if landed on. You no longer warm up through regular movement, and the Oasis takes longer to warm a dwarf. The Ice Praetorian now freezes dwarves faster with the Spit attack, and slower with the Frost Clouds. Let's skip over all the way to Update 25, because you know it, to rack up some of those changes. First, the Cryo Bulb features brand new effects for its explosion. Moving through deep snow is less cumbersome, as it doesn't slow you down as much. The temperature UI element is entirely different. It appears that a lot of the biome's freezing elements were toned down, generally made less egregious. This also should have been around the time that ice variant creatures receive more fire damage. But you be the judge. And that's it. This is yet another case where the biome barely changed since its initial release, only receiving a few touch-ups to make everyone's time in it more bearable. But would you believe me if I told you that this snow animation from all those updates ago is still exactly the same in Season 4? And probably 5? Or how the textures for when an unstable ice thing shatters is all wrong now? Even though the game director himself doesn't discriminate the biomes and likes all of them, he did admit to adding a bit too many features to this one. For proof, you'll have to extract the one out of my brain because I heard it while I was at their offices. But I can only think of one other biome that has way too many pretty things in it. It's time for some Azure Weald. It's one that I consider to be the second biome introduced through updates, since the other one was brought in mid-development. Sort of. We'll get to that. This was the concept art used as a basis for the biome's overall feel. If it looks a bit rough, it's because I ripped it from their old art showcase streams. And here's the earliest in-game screenshot I was able to find. This comes from the mission selection. Seems like a prototype of the biome as it's lacking the huge variety of plants. But this is the earliest Azure Weald build that I was able to get. While it's already quite filled in, it is missing a ton of stuff. For starters, this shot should give a decent idea of the biome's vibe at this time. If not for this green thing, here's a better view, you could easily fool anyone into thinking this is from the most recent build. The plants found in this build are a different colored Pulsa stickpod, apricots, and bloopy fruits, all of which cannot be squished by feet, but can be destroyed by pickaxes. Another familiar but miscolored plant is the Umbra Seeker. It features very small spots on its backside and a celestial ambient sound when stood very close to. An odd feature is the Deep Tora Honeycomb. It gives us an idea of what they were planning for this biome at the time. Oh yeah, and these loopy things are also present. In the next build, some features were added into the biome, and that Deep Tora Honeycomb was removed. Most notably, an early cave angel was added with quite a different design. It could be indeed grabbed onto and ridden like a living paraglider. The Orchis Shy was added, but there's something obviously off about it. They were added as if they're part of the biome's grass where it can be removed with one pickaxe hit. They likely did this to quickly check if the new plant fits the biome's aesthetics before implementing it properly. Wall Azep was added. Gherkinchuck was added in a very similar manner, so it'll lack any distinctive features. Even its coloring is entirely different from the release, coming in lime green and pink. The Umbra Seeker had its green parts made more neon lime. Blue particle effects float around it, and the pulsating effect is much more prominent. Those green rock protrusions were recolored to be purple. These small white flowers were added, alongside the small tropical bush. And lastly, the strange light source is now present. In this next build, they added a bunch of new features, making a huge step to its release counterpart. The Gherkinchuck was recolored to be dark blue and pink, as well as a few pink dots float around it. Nectar Rind was added. At this time was called Ninup, and a part of me wishes it stayed that way. Its behavior was reversed where the plant could stay closed and only open when approached. Could be recycled behavior from the Glowlit. An early version of the Hexawing was added. It's quite literally a pink fester flea, but it does feature the creature's sounds. The tropical bush was recolored to purple. Orchis Shy was also properly implemented and closes when approached by dwarves. Umbra Seeker's base was recolored to a gradient of green to purple. Its top was also made green and has a bunch of yellow things flying near it. This thing was called Floara at this time. I am pretty sure it's just a funny placeholder. Wall Azep was recolored and given collision. Pulsa Stickpod was also recolored to shades of green that fit the biome's color palette. The Combo Charm was added. To me, it looks very wrong that nothing happens when it's destroyed. Void Basket was added, and it already matches up with the release version. The only difference is that the sound it emits is much louder. Kalos Eater was added. It lacks detail on its petals and pistil, but functionally it's identical. The Cave Angel had its design adjusted. It now features a flapping animation when flying, and this weird pulsating effect on its wings that don't stop even when the game is paused. And lastly, the Magic Hole was added in all its glory. Contains strange glowy bubbles inside of it and reduces the dwarf's gravity when jumped through. There's also an odd bug attached to this thing. In escort duty, for one reason or another, the last cave features a blinding amount of these bubbles. Now approaching a pretty late development build, so most things will be in place. For starters, the petals and pistil of the Kalos Eater were given more detail. The tendrils of the Nectar Rind are now cyan colored, and their behavior was reversed, now closing when approached instead of opening. The Hexawing Niffer has a unique model now, featuring 6 wings to stay true to its name, has pink eyes, not a pink eye, and is also fully animated. Its behavior is still the equivalent of a fester flea if it was a lot slower. The region's maggot was recolored to cyan. The Cave Angel's model was greatly polished up, emits unique sounds and features some animations for when being grabbed onto. The Umbra Seeker now makes a strange beating sound when close to it. And the Void Basket had its sound changed, or just pitched down? Gherkinchuck now releases a pink mist when approached. And lastly, the strange rocks were added. All it's really missing is the defense buff and a broken name on the ping tool. Now let's hop on over to Update 33's release. This is where the biome was introduced to the public. The Hexawing was given blue eyes instead of pink. The Cave Angel is fully polished, featuring a full set of animations as well as unique noises for when a dwarf is hanging onto it.
Sorry, pretty lady.
Combo Charm, when destroyed, will release its Combo Bud, which can be kicked and eventually destroyed. Rare spawns like the Strange Rocks now provide with a defensive buff to both dwarves and creatures. Here's an example of the buff negating some of the fall damage. And here's an example of the buff applied to a Glyphid. This guard is able to withstand 2 boomstick shots noticeably better. The Magic Hole was given a movement speed buff that once again can be applied to dwarves and creatures. But this one is difficult to compare as the Glyphid movement speed is already pretty inconsistent. And hey, you know the drill by now. Nothing else was really done to the biome since its release. At some point in 2023, they claim to have made the biome's textures or walls brighter. I'll let you be the judge of that. Now moving on to what I consider to be the latest biome introduced through an update. I carry this sentiment since during development Caustic Mire was originally meant to release alongside Azure Weald, but it ultimately ended up being replaced by Bough. My guess is that the developers simply found this location to be much more intriguing, and having a concept that stands out definitely helped. Just like with Azure Weald, I also got a little sneak peek at the prototype state of this biome thanks to the biome's overview image. And honestly, the version of the biome I have here appears to be identical to the one in the image. For all I know, it could be the same version. First, we can already see various tree lichen and tiny thorns or vines poking throughout the wooden surfaces. Giant thorns are unsurprisingly already part of the biome as it's one of the main features. Retractable vines are present in this prototype. They feature very minimalistic retraction mechanics when shot, and they'll regrow only when dwarves get further away from it. Stabber vines have an entirely different appearance. It's also lacking colors and textures for most of its body. Oh yeah, it can spawn with 2 vines instead of 3 sometimes. The red vine sprawling through it will light up yellow when it's locked onto a target. Then it'll extend for a stab. They can also be individually destroyed, which causes the corresponding vine to explode like a spitballer, and release poisonous clouds around the area for quite a while. Interestingly, the red cave leech was a thing in this prototype of Bough. This little experiment of recolored creatures doesn't get scrapped until near the end of the biome's development. Lastly, I know someone who's gonna lose their minds over this, but there is a red spitballer alongside the cave leech. It behaves exactly the same as the regular one. Bask in the glory of this fleshy red. Heading on over to the next development build. Let's not beat around the bush. The fog has entirely changed to a washed out blue. 2 types of lichen or shrubbery were added to the cave floors. Those early stabber vines were painted brown. Bough cones were added. They spawn in their physics-based state from the get-go. They couldn't be kicked at this time, but knocking them around wasn't difficult either. Deep Tora Honeycomb was added as a placeholder, and I am fairly certain some new vine formations were added as well. In the next build, the biome received some small changes. Most notably, the fog isn't as intense anymore. The region's maggot is now yellow with a strong glow. Another type of lichen was added. The tiny red roots were made much thicker now. Up until this point, hitting the terrain didn't create a splinter effect. In this iteration, it does. And lastly, the dirt walls were replaced by hardened zap, since originally this biome was meant to feature a lot more sap. Here's a notable example of this fact from an art showcase years ago. And in the last development build, the biome gets quite the uplift. These types of tree-like formations are seemingly more prominent from here on out. Some of the lichen was removed and replaced with this bark-like foliage and thorny weed flowers. The thorn pot was added, although destroying it will yield nothing at this time. Retractable spikes were added to some thick thorn formations. While they do deal damage, they cannot be destroyed yet. Creeper Vine now has that neat retraction and growing mechanic applied to it. This apparently was made possible thanks to the refinery's pipes. Stabber Vine got a much needed redesign. Its behavior is still quite early. You'll notice how various debug geometry gets drawn on screen as it attacks. This debug geometry corresponds to the expected attack direction of the vine. And I should note that the stabbers have significantly less health in this iteration. Goo sacks were added. But Goo Explosion isn't quite up to snuff as it instantly plops down. Bough cones now grow out from the ceiling and need to be dislodged with bullets to get the physics-based cones to drop, which in turn can finally be kicked around. With each kick, a distinctive barrel kicking sound is heard. Why rewrite the same code from scratch when you can just reuse it? Also, Tumbleweed, or Dry Thorn Tumble, was added. It also features the same barrel borrowed kicking. These small variations of the vines will soon be removed as they look much too similar to the creeper vine. What did get removed is the hardened sap. The dirt still seems a bit too smooth, but it's pretty much back. And lastly, when hitting the terrain with a pickaxe, a different type of wood effect is seen. Instead of splinters of wood, it produces a bunch of wood bark. This of course was changed back pretty quickly. And as always, let's skip over to the release build of Hollowbough. One last type of lichen shrubbery, or whatever you want to call it, was added. Creeper vines hide much quicker and reveal themselves slower. Something about these little adjustments made it mesmerizing to look at. Deep Tora Bough wasp nests were added. They act the same as their honeycomb counterpart, except the wasps would persist even when the nest was destroyed. This was unintentional as it was patched out in a hotfix. Stabberwine's behavior and mechanics were greatly refined, plus were given a bunch of unique sounds. Like it'll push dwarves that it hits, and can pretty much infinitely stretch if the attack is triggered. Goosack Explosion. While the goop still kinda teleports to the ground, it was given some sounds and effects to make it look better. When destroying the thorn pot, it'll now release a ton of those thorns. Retractable vine spikes can now be removed from its vine. They will also push dwarves back when making contact with one. The region's recolored maggots don't glow as strongly. Glyphid eggs can now spawn. These random bark details were added. There's now proper sound for when kicking the cones or thorn tumble. And lastly, the corpse feeders were added. They hide from any nearby dwarves and can be easily killed with one shot. Intriguing how one of my favorite biome additions was added quite late. For the last time, the biome hasn't changed at all since its release. Except the Glyphid eggs became a secondary objective for Season 5. I guess. Oh, and I never mentioned the nipple plant that we sadly didn't see in-game. Maybe I shouldn't have mentioned that. Let's slow down a bit. What is an hour-long evolution episode without some bonus chapters? This time around, the bonus chapters will feel a lot more like a bonus since they'll lack an evolution element. Well, I guess you could take it as a meta evolution if things change later. Regardless, now's time for a very special chapter indeed. Caustic Mire. Nobody has seen or heard anything of this thing since it was replaced by Hollowbough for Update 33. Yet, there was a prototype made of it. I personally don't like the idea of it, as it sounds like Fungus Bogs too. But I have been waiting for a long time to show this thing. Here's the publicly released concept art of the biome, and here's the extended version I found in their art showcase. So, let's get to it. In the prototype, the biome's colors are green walls with some gray texturing, brown floors with some granite pebbles, and large granite stacks such as these. It very prominently features crevices, sometimes in crazy abundances, giving it a unique appearance. As for the features, there's this puddle of goop and rubble. Has no real functionality, but then you dig into it. For some reason it pushes you back. I believe this is a remnant from Glacial Strata's Oasis, and that this might be a heavily modified version of it. The next feature are these brittle surfaces. These patches feature grass and rocks. They can be dug through with only one hit. I should mention that the rest of the terrain takes 3 hits, giving a somewhat unique approach to the digging. And finally, there's the toxic geysers, spraying what seem to be toxic fumes on rare occasions. But in this prototype, they act the same as steam geysers. So will this biome ever finish development? From my understanding, this biome has stuck with Robert for a long time. He is the game's art director, so the possibility definitely isn't zero. Also, just to mess with your head, here's Caustic Mire with the facility mission type. And for the last bonus chapter, I've got Sponge Cluster. Except sadly I wasn't able to see what it's like in-game. I even tried getting a developer to load up the biome while I was at their offices. It just ended up crashing the Unreal editor. Sponge Cluster is a biome I spotted out some years ago during one of those art showcase segments. All we had to go off of was this concept art meant to capture the biome's mood. I really adored the color palette of it, not to mention the strange bubbly look to it, like a generic region being infested with all these organic things. Mikkel was generous enough to share whatever there was made for Sponge Cluster, and with that, we got a description of its general idea. Wet and squishy, this peculiar environment used to be fully submerged, but virulently, spreading strange of sponge formations have sucked up most moisture, and secured it safely within themselves for the century-long gestation process. It is a strange place, devoid of most of the plant life you see elsewhere, and instead mostly inhabited by creeping clusters of pulsing sponge. While that marks our finish line for the big stuff, there is one more thing. We return to these insanely early biome concepts that Robert made. I bet you forgot about this, so let's see how many of these ideas I can recognize in the context of, well, everything I just showcased. Obsidian Hall sounds like a much more lively version of Magma Core to me, from volcanic conditions to the earthquakes and even more matches. Neon Garden's description sounds a lot like Azure Weald. We could even see some of those neon colors with the lime green terrain, and for those early plant colors. Deep Glacier is obviously Glacial Strata, but there's some really interesting ideas here that didn't make it in, like ice worms. Guess we could pretend that they are still there and we just don't see them. Fungus Morass is literally Fungus Bogs. I think this is one concept that hasn't changed much. Uranium Infestation also sounds a lot like Radioactive Exclusion Zone, almost undoubtedly, especially with how it mentions of a lush place, and we witness radioactive waste in the closed alpha biomes. Is that in some twisted up way what Exclusion Zone looked like before its radiation corruption? Caustic Depths. Well, I think we can make an easy guess that this became Caustic Mire. Since we only saw the prototype version, there's nothing we can really read into here. Moss Chapel is an interesting one. From the color scheme and description, this sounds a lot like radioactive wastes. Some of the ideas here also sound like they were reused for Hollow Bough and Fungus Bogs. Steam Bogs. While this has some references to salt, we now know that Mikkel kinda came up with salt pits on a whim. I think this one is an unused biome. It probably made a few marks on salt pits, but this is definitely not its origin. Ideas such as hot springs could have been recycled for Glacial Strata. Hive Core. Half of this sounds entirely unique, and the other half sounds a lot like Hollow Bough. Specifically, wriggling maggots definitely are the corpse feeders. Or interludes with spiky black thorn structures are really just the thorns but are now colored red. These last two I found to be extra interesting, so I got Hobbs to draw some DRG style concepts of these. Inverted Forest. About the only thing we have from this are those cave mines. It would be easy to assume some other ideas were reused for Fungus Bogs, but in my opinion, this is an entirely unseen biome. Upside down trees? None of the biomes have done that. And the living metal. This... wow. I think this is an entirely new concept. I can see how this idea might have influenced Radioactive Zone or Crystalline Caverns. Other than the slight influences, this is entirely new, and honestly has left me intrigued as to what this thing could look like. Well, that about does it. But how can I be sure that she'll retain any of the information I've dumped onto you today? Oh, I've had this idea of doing a devolution. Yeah, let's roll it all the way back. I'm a firm believer that repetition is the key to trapping information into one's mind after all. Starting off with Azure Weald's Season 5 appearance. This biome is the most notable for how chock full of features it is. We'll be starting from here and we'll go all the way back to its conceptual phase. Now, onto the previous build.